Good morning and welcome. Welcome everyone to the webinar Impacts of LNG Export and Market Power on Australia's Electricity Market Dynamics 2016 to 2019. I'm Simon Holmescourt and I'm Senior Advisor at the Energy Transition Hub and the Climate and Energy College at Melbourne University. Please join me in acknowledging the traditional owners of the various lands from which we're joining this webinar and in paying my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to acknowledge that this webinar is being hosted by the Climate and Energy College and the Energy Transition Hub. I'd like to mention this webinar is being recorded and the video will be made shortly available on the College and Hub websites. Today's speaker is Dr. Dylan Mcconnell. Dylan is an Energy Systems Research Fellow at the University of Melbourne, University of Melbourne's Climate and Energy College, and he's a researcher at the Multi-Institutional Energy Transition Hub. Dylan has extensive experience in analysing the electricity sector in Australia. His work is focused on electricity infrastructure and governance and energy transition in liberalised electricity markets. Dylan specialises in operations research and the optimisation of electricity systems. His work is interdisciplinary and has been published in forums including the Journal of Energy Policy, the Journal of Applied Energy, Electricity Journal and the Journal of Environmental Sociology. His work can also be found at the conversation. At the bottom of your screen are two buttons, chat and QA. If you have any questions for Dylan, please post them in the Q&A and I'll try to get to as many as I can at the end of the talk. You can upvote questions and I'll definitely take note of the more popular questions. Feel free to use the chat panel as you normally look, but please don't post questions there as I will only be monitoring the Q&A channel. So we'll save the questions for the end, but without any further ado, let me introduce you to Dr. Dylan Mcconnell.
Oops. Great, thanks Simon. Thanks for that introduction. Sorry, I'm just gonna. Okay, just get to my. Hopefully you can see my screen okay. Yep, okay, excellent. All right, well, yeah, thanks for the introduction. And yeah, today I'll be talking about a sort of a draft chapter that Mike Sandiford and I have recently put together. I think Mike might be on the presentation with us today. And yeah, it's essentially, you know, looking at a whole range of issues that have sort of evolved in the electricity and gas sector over the last sort of you know, couple of months or couple of years actually. Essentially, we've seen sorry, I'll just go through. This is the backdrop of all of this is essentially a large increase in wholesale prices that I think anyone that's been following the developments in the national electricity market will be aware of. Now, these are both in relative and absolute terms. This is a figure that actually shows our electricity prices in the context of international prices as well. So as you can see, we have historically had very low wholesale prices. These are in euros per megawatt hour. But in the last couple of years, we have very much seen a rapid increase to well above, you know, in some cases, you know, we've gone, for example, the Japanese price, we were a fraction of that, and now we're actually well above that, or we were well above that, and those have sort of come down in recent months. I guess an interesting observation that sort of, you know, part of this work was that these rising wholesale prices were essentially triggered, or sorry, related to, or very closely correlated with the gas prices. So this figure shows the volume weighted prices for the whole NEM of electricity market. That's the Eastern Seaboard, States, South Australia, Victoria, Queensland, you know, basically not Western Australia and Northern Territory, and the benchmark prices in Wallumbilla. Now this, you know, it basically basically was the driver of some of this work, is looking at this particular linkage and the linkage between the gas export market and the electricity sector, to sort of understand how I guess supply side shocks flow through to the electricity market. And yeah, so to go through this, today we'll be talking about the gas sector on the supply side, and also the demand to some extent, and how that's changed over the last 5+ years, and what that's meant for prices. And then we'll talk about the electricity sector, the direct impacts of gas prices on the electricity sector, and then talk about some of the competition issues and how they have manifested. The two have combined in a perfect storm to basically create an issue for electricity prices as well. Then we'll conclude with some sort of some final comments and yeah, questions and answers afterwards. So yeah, as this figure shows, our gas market has changed dramatically over the last sort of 5 to 6 years. This is a figure, and yeah, again, I'd like to acknowledge Mike Sanderford for a lot of these figures. Perhaps the nicer looking ones are courtesy of Mike. We have the supply from the sort of 3 main producing zones, various basins across the eastern seaboard. We have the blue is Victoria, green is Queensland, and red is South Australia, as well as showing the increase in demand from both Gladstone in terms of exports, but also in terms of the direct use that they have on site to actually produce the LNG. They do actually consume quite a bit of LNG. There's a bit of a range there in terms of how much it might be, but say we've sort of used a 9% figure in terms of the amount that is self-consumed to actually produce that LNG export. Now, yeah, as you can see, a lot of that export capacity has essentially come from LNG, so from the Queensland fields. And what is that was notionally, I guess, supposed to be the demand from the LNG export terminals was notionally supposed to be fulfilled from these Queensland fields, but yeah, that hasn't necessarily played out because of some resources haven't come online as much as was originally projected, or have been slower, or have delivered less gas. So this shows the supply demand situation for the gas side of the equation in Queensland. From the beginning of 2016, the Curtis Island actually started slightly before that, but that's where we have data from. And you can see, in theory at least, there's a gap between supply and demand. But what is more important is how that gap has changed, and how that or what that gap is relative to the historical number, which is what this figure shows. So in the dotted line, we have essentially the supply demand, or the supply from Queensland sort of historically, and how that sort of net supply, once you take away the exports from Curtis Island, have basically removed that supply from the domestic situation. Now, so you can see in some periods in 2017, Queensland was importing gas to meet its domestic supply. And now that has, I guess, also flowed through to the rest of the interconnected market, because we have this gas system is actually connected to the southern states, particularly through this Southwestern Queensland pipeline. It's the only one that goes to the other states, and you can see a pretty marked change in the flows on that. So that's the figure on the yeah, basically from when the Curtis Island demand started up from 2015, you can see a pretty dramatic change in the flows on that pipeline. Basically, and positive flows represent essentially imports, and negative flows represent exports. So sort of historically, Queensland was an exporter of gas, and then after the startup of the Curtis Island import terminal, it's become a dramatic importer, or a significantly changed to being an importer, and has fluctuated over the last couple of years. Now that has also flowed through to Eastern Seaboard gas prices. So this shows the essentially the spot price gas for the two main markets. We have two spot gas markets in the Eastern Seaboard states. We have the so-called short-term trading market and the declared wholesale gas market for Victoria. And basically, we can see a very, very substantial increase in gas prices following the development of that export market. Now, I guess one thing that's just as a quick side note to throw in here is the question of reservation policy, and this was a big question at the time of the firing up of the starting up of the Curtis Island and the LNG exports, is whether or not we should have a reservation policy, and we don't have, well, we have a pseudo reservation policy at the moment now, following various machinations and some recommendations from the ACCC. We have the so-called Australian domestic gas security mechanism, but a good comparison point on this might be Western Australia, which does have a reservation policy. So this figure just shows the difference between the Victorian spot price and the Western Australian spot price over that same period. So we essentially have one market that was, partly undersupplied, or at least the domestic balance was undersupplied from the perspective of, the delivery from those Western Queensland fields, sucking up gas from the rest of the NEM, and driving up the wholesale gas spot prices. Now, that in and of itself, is part of the story, and perhaps not a surprising part of the story for people that have been following the developments of the gas industry over the years. The other part of it, which we'll talk a bit more about now, is what it's done to the electricity sector. Now, increased gas prices have a couple of interact with the electricity sector in some obvious ways. Firstly, there's the increased direct cost of generation via people having to procure gas and buy more gas, competing with the new export linked pricing. So as old contracts roll over and new supply has to be secured, they have to compete at this new sort of higher price. And then the second sort of perhaps more obvious way is through basically the opportunity cost of gas generation. If there is some spot exposure, or if they're not fully contracted, then there is an opportunity cost for a gas generator to not burn that electricity. Not burn that gas for electricity, and potentially sell that back to the export markets, or fulfill other obligations, or so on. I mean, I guess if you haven't contracted and you do need to buy gas to run your turbine because of your obligations or contract position in the electricity market, then your direct costs are also the spot price as well. Now, that has a direct impact on gas generation, because it does, and that does flow through to the way that they set their price. But there's sort of a curious thing that partly informed this work, was the fact that gas generation doesn't, as much as it does play an important role, or it can play an important role in setting the price in the electricity market. It's often the marginal generator. It's not the marginal generator as often as you might think. It might be in the vicinity of 20% of the time. And yet, as you would have seen in that previous slide on the linkage between the gas prices and the electricity prices, there is still a very strong link. So, other technologies, notably coal and hydro, are actually setting the price a lot of the time, and yet they seem to be pricing to gas prices. So this comes to this sort of third point, that gas prices have also sort of impacted the electricity market in this sort of third indirect way that is related to market concentration in the electricity sector, and basically allows particularly coal generators and hydro generators, for that matter, to what they call shadow price against the price of gas. Now, this is we'll talk about that a bit later on, but firstly, talk a bit more about these competition issues. So, just as a way of example, this is what this is some old data for Torrens Island's projected fuel costs. They've gone from the sort of historic low average or low sort of prices that we have in the NEM of sort of $4.40 a gigajoule, and now they're sort of being projected in the 8+ range. But yes, competition is it's an issue that comes up sporadically in the NEM, and I think it's fair to say it's a bit of an issue at the moment, for a variety of reasons. It has been sort of flagged as an issue in South Australia for quite a long time, because of I guess partly because of the fact that it's quite a small market dominated by only really one particularly big gentailer, but across the NEM it's also becoming more of an issue with consolidation in some of the other markets, and government ownership in Queensland, for example, and other and closure of coal-fired power stations is also creating I guess a more concentrated market for what's left. Now, a common metric to look at competition and concentration is the Hhi Index, and essentially what this is it's basically a number between 0 and 10,000. It's basically you're summing up all of the market shares of you're squaring the market shares as a percentage. So that's why it's between 1 and 10,000, 100 squared being, a monopoly would have a Hhi of 10,000. Now, this is used across a variety of industries, and there's a couple of benchmarks that that are used across other sectors. So in Australia, the ACCC flags 2,000, Hhi of 2,000 to be an issue. In the United States, they say between 1,500 and 2,500 would be considered a highly concentrated, a concentrated market, and above that, highly concentrated. And then I guess another relevant metric here is the UK's Ofgem guidelines. So historically, there's been a pretty big divergence these days, but historically, the NEM was essentially based off the UK system, and basically, these are all sort of saying that 2,000 is a concentrated market, and across the NEM, the Hhi is actually above that. It varies, across times and across years, and when trading rights change and when different things change. But it's fair to say that the Australian national electricity market is fairly concentrated. Another metric that is because there are limitations with this Hhi metric, particularly in the electricity sector. Another one is called the so-called pivotal supply index, and this is basically like looking at the percentage of time or proportion of time that one generator is absolutely, the largest generator is basically needed to make sure that that demand is met. There's a couple of different ways, similar metrics. I think the AER uses residual supply index, RSI, which is essentially the same, but I think they may do something slightly different, but it's a similar measure. And so it basically means that there is periods of market power is transient in electricity markets. It's there's some market power is sort of okay. There is allowed to be market power in periods of scarcity. Like that's essentially how the market is supposed to work. But then it shouldn't happen too often. If there's too much scarcity, or sorry, if one generator is needed to meet demand too much of the time, then that generator is basically said to be pivotal. Without its generation, the system can't be supplied, and they have a substantial ability to look at that to impact prices. Now, this shows that index over the period 2012 to 2016. I'm actually updating this figure to go out to the current figures, but I don't have that ready yet because there are a couple of things that have changed in this period. Notably, the closure of Hazelwood in early 2017 would have dramatically changed the pivotal supplier index for Victoria, and also to some extent how you treat a single generator, or a single participant also changes this. So, the single largest generator in New South Wales, for example, is Eraring. It's a big, 2,800 megawatt black coal plant. But the other two coal plants, Liddell and Bayswater, they are both owned by the same generator, that being AGL. So that's it's over 3,000 megawatts of It's over 4,000 megawatts of capacity of black coal capacity that's owned by a single participant. So if you look at how often they are pivotal, it's actually quite a lot of the time. So taking into account ownership arrangements can dramatically change this. And the other, I guess, example would be in Queensland, where we used to have three state. Well, we do have 3 state-owned generators again now, but for a long time there was 3 state-owned corporations, and it was close to a decade ago now. The Tarong generator, which was also a state-owned corporation, was essentially split off into the other 2. So there was only 2, CS Energy and Stanwell. So for a very long time, if you could treat those as a pivotal generator in their own right, then essentially the supply in Queensland is incredibly concentrated, because it's the same owner and it's the same. Their generation is almost always pivotal in that sense. But yeah, I guess the key point I want to point out is that the metrics, both of these metrics don't exactly inspire confidence that the market is operating in a particularly competitive way, and we're basically seeing this in a variety of other measures. So one being price cost margins. So talk a little bit about those. Basically, this is these metrics are nice, I guess, the HHI and the pivotal supply index, but the actual fundamental measure of the degree of market power is how much, basically how much rent you can extract, the price cost margin. So the difference between your costs and your prices. It's essentially the monopoly rent. That quote's actually from a fairly famous market power economist, electricity market power economist named Borenstein, and basically this is not so much a metric or a theoretical construct like the pivotal supplier index or the HHI, but this is actually a measure of how much monopoly rent is being extracted. And yeah, this another way of thinking about price cost margins can be, I guess, illustrated in the electricity in terms of something called the spark spread for gas generators. It's the difference between what your costs are and what your value is, or just the margin essentially that you're facing. And yeah, this was in the lead up to, or this was looking at the situation following the closure of the Northern Power Station in South Australia in particular, and we saw a dramatic increase in that price cost margin in South Australia that is indicative of exercise of market power. Another measure in electricity markets of price cost margins is called the dark spread, and that's basically the difference between, so spark spread, difference between gas prices and electricity prices, dark spread, difference between coal prices and electricity prices. Now this one's an interesting one, because I guess with gas we do have a degree of transparency around the gas prices to some extent. That's I guess a bit contested if you read some of the stuff the ACCC has to say, but the fuel prices of black coal are actually quite difficult to get a hold of. They're not very transparent. Quite often we have mouth of mine plants in the NEM, or other sort of arrangements. And thankfully, or fortunately, the ACCC has some information gathering powers that actually forced in an inquiry in 2018. This is why this data set goes up to 2018 to I guess expose the real fuel costs. Other organisations, including AEMO, look at they have estimates of fuel costs, but we don't really have any. They get consultants to come up with what they think the fuel costs are, but until this ACCC report came out, we sort of didn't have any really good visibility on what they actually were. And what it does show is that yes, we have seen another big increase in the price cost margin for coal generators as well. Now, so these are, I guess, all indicators of shadow pricing. Of market concentration concerns and market power abuses, and the direct practice has actually essentially been, I guess, quite openly revealed by the ACCC in that report I was just referring to. Now they quote a few different generators. One of them in particular, I think, is quite quite interesting. It's basically from one of their internal bidding strategy documents, where they basically explicitly say that they are running they're bidding their coal generation at just below the gas price. Basically, as it says, they're bidding their coal generation at prices that ensure full dispatch at the highest price before it would result in a gas generator turning on. Now that's a completely rational thing to do, I guess, if you're in a monopoly position, or if you don't have a very strong competitive pressures, because if you did have strong competition, what they would actually be doing is coal plants would be competing with other coal plants, and not essentially what we're seeing is gas prices being a point of tacit collusion. It's not, well, I think it's tacit collusion. There's no evidence to suggest there's actual collusion, but if you did have a proper competition between the different coal generators, then you would not see this behaviour of gas prices bidding just below what the gas price is. I should point out it's even though these quotes have sort of point the finger at black coal generators, it's also hydro generators as well. I think Snowy Hydro was also pointed to in the ACCC report, as well as also doing this, basically pricing just below gas to maximise their prices. Again, yep, it's a I guess a completely rational thing for them to do, but it's certainly doesn't seem to be in the interests of consumers. Now, this report was prepared. It was prepared and finalised and published in mid-2018, and since then we've had got essentially some new data point. And there's quite a lot going on in this diagram, but this is I think, so to speak, the smoking gun of some of this stuff is that since then we have had, since the start of this year, we have had a pretty significant collapse in gas prices, essentially because of COVID, because of the impact that the impact that COVID has had on the export. I think I may have missed that on a previous slide that showed that the export volumes have dropped off somewhat because of declining demand from sort of Asian consumers in particular, but that has essentially basically pushed prices down a long way in the NEM or the Eastern Seaboard gas prices, and that has also flowed through to electricity prices. And this sort of provides another very powerful data point to this this relationship between gas and electricity prices. In sort of prior to this, we sort of had the one-way relation, or what happens when when the gas prices were up, and there were lots of competing narratives around what was driving electricity prices. Sure, there was higher gas prices, but there were questions around there were other questions around whether or not there were related to renewable energy or other coal plants exiting, or all of these other factors that were not related to gas. I think what we can say that now that we're seeing this relationship, this very strong relationship being maintained as gas prices come down, suggests that gas prices have a pretty strong explanatory power when it comes to electricity prices. So this is so on in the I guess the red, we've got the relationship between gas prices and electricity prices prior to Curtis Island opening up. And then in the blue, we have the relationship between, since then. And I should point out on this figure as well, this is only looking at electricity prices, so-called energy prices, so prices below $300 a megawatt hour. It doesn't take into account scarcity events, or when prices go up to the market price cap of $14,000. This is just looking at the sort of the energy range of electricity prices, and similarly with the gas prices, this is only going up to $10 a gigajoule. Once you go beyond, there's certainly periods where the spot prices was above $10 a gigajoule, but that's a sort of a different it's a different regime, let's say, of interaction between the gas and the electricity prices. But what is, I think, quite striking is what the strength of this relationship of sort of an R-squared value of 0.73, but also that it's held up over even today, in sort of late 20 or mid 2020, when we've got gas prices hovering around the $4 to $5 mark, and we've seen electricity prices fall in a commensurate sort of way that's still consistent with this relationship. Over I guess you probably heard in the last couple of months, the weeks reporting period, we've had the likes of AGL and Origin have certainly taken pretty big hits to their sort of bottom line. This is certainly not all of the story, but certainly if you see, you're starting to see, say, Origin's Eraring plant. So that's probably the highest, or getting close to the highest marginal cost coal plant in the NEM that's actually seems to be at least competing with gas prices at the moment. It's actually being a marginal generator, and not shadow pricing to gas, but actually competing with gas. But yeah, this I guess points to this issue of market power, and with the combination of market power and the gas prices basically flowing through to electricity prices in a way that was perhaps not initially intended. So just to conclude, yeah, I guess, you know, it's probably, it's not a surprise that we would have, shocks, supply shocks to the gas sector propagate through to the electricity sector. In fact, people predicted that, back in 2012 or 2013. And yeah, there's obviously some challenges, or it's not directly possible to directly attribute cause and effect, but it certainly seems that the substantial 9 or 10-fold increase in demand from the LNG trains, combined with a lack of performance from some of those fields, and competition issues, has basically flowed through to pretty poor outcomes from the electricity sector. Now, yeah, I think a lot of the arguments around reservation policies and the interaction back 5-6 years ago, or probably didn't take into account the degree of this, how this might flow through to the electricity sector. And I think that was perhaps a bit of a failure there to properly consider this interaction. And yeah, in terms of some sort of high level back of the envelope kind of stuff, it sort of seems like we're seeing with the threat of the Australian domestic gas security mechanism, more so than its actual use, is having some effect, a sort of pseudo reservation policy of sorts. But yeah, it's sort of, some figures that Mike put together suggest that something as small as a 6% gas reservation policy would have perhaps alleviated a lot of the supply issues for the domestic market, and perhaps resulted in much less price impacts for the electricity sector. I guess one thing that's also worth mentioning is that some of these competition issues are, let's say, through no fault of their own in terms of the governments. Things like the closure of power stations that will necessarily, as transition unfolds, that will necessarily result in an increase in a temporary or transient increase in market power. That's unavoidable to some degree. But other issues are perhaps also more avoidable. For example, a perfect example is, and this is not to just blame the ACCC or the competition regulator, because they have actually tried to prevent some of these competition issues in the past. Most notably, the acquisition of Liddell and Bayswater by AGL. They originally didn't allow that transaction, I think twice, in fact, but that was appealed to the Australian Competition Tribunal and ultimately approved. And then, so now we have, one generator in control of a substantial proportion of the capacity in New South Wales, and similarly in Queensland we have two state-owned monopolies that also have a substantial market share. But yeah, I guess this is a sort of a cautionary tale, or at least an example of what happens with supply side shocks. I'll get that right eventually, and concentrated markets under transition. All right, I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Dylan. That was great. I got the privilege of asking the first question.
Sure.
So during 2017, we saw very significant increases in electricity prices in Australia, and that was at the time in the political and media sphere blamed firmly on renewables, that price increase. And we see with your data the very high correlation between gas and electricity prices really strongly supports this hypothesis, or even fact we could call it, that shadow pricing of gas and increasing gas prices drove it. So we have to reject that claim that renewables drove prices up. But should we also reject the claims that people are making that it's renewables that are driving prices down right now, and that the predominant effect is actually gas?
Yeah, I think the predominant effect is at the moment is certainly gas. I think that's pretty uncontroversial. The question about renewables driving up and down prices is it's a question of timescales, I guess. And if you're thinking about long-term and short-term dynamics, and it comes back to sort of an underlying principle called the capacity cycle. Now, basically, as it's sort of it's not, the capacity cycle is an electricity market term, but it's not particularly novel. It's basically, if you increase supply, prices go down. If prices go down, that encourages either more consumption, or it doesn't encourage new entry, or in the case of it might encourage coal plants to leave, or other plants that high cost plants to leave the market. And then as a result of that, you have the sort of flip side is that prices will go, rebound, they'll go high, and then that'll encourage new investment, and that'll bring in, so if to the extent that renewables do depress price, I think that's absolutely true. But to the extent that you can attribute that to the closure of, say, a coal plant, then you can also make an argument that they increase, they reduce available supply. They tighten the so-called reserve margin, which also increases prices. So it's sort of a question of time frames, and longer. So in the longer term, and there's it's not a straightforward this X causes Y, but yeah, it's certainly in terms of so that's sort of the longer investment scale horizon. But in the short term, in terms of what we're seeing in the last couple of months, it certainly seems to be gas prices that are driving the price reductions.
Great, thanks, Dylan. I'm going to hand over to Chang to ask a question of Dylan. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Hi, Dylan. A very interesting presentation. This is Chang from the Energy Transition Hub. My question is, the Australian chef scientist Alan Finkel believed and argued that gas would be a transition fuel for Australia. And what is your opinion? And what is the reason not to invest in gas?
Good question. So there's I think I've just unpicked that a little bit. I don't think it's actually fair to say that the the chief scientist explicitly thinks that gas is a transition fuel. At least I'm just thinking about there was the article just this morning where he pointed to its use in the electricity sector, but he sort of stepped away from expanding the idea of expanding the gas industry. And I think that in the short term, we use gas in the electricity sector, but it's actually a very, very small amount of our globe, our annual consumption. It's at the moment, I can't remember off the top of my head. What is it? There's 1900 petajoules ish a year we consume, that we supply, or that's exports plus domestic and electricity generation and industrial use. About 150 petajoules of that is gas, and that is projected, or expected to decline. So in terms of the broader gas story, I don't see it as an argument for expanding the gas industry. For one, it appears gas consumption in the electricity sector is declining, and it's such a small part of the total consumption. In the longer term, gas is a fossil fuel, and there are alternatives to it in its use in the electricity sector, and for that matter, heating in the domestic and commercial sector. That's probably the lowest value use of our gas. And if people are worried about gas consumption or gas supply, then burning it in the electricity sector or in your home or in your business is probably the worst thing you can do with it. If for heat, there are obviously some industries, things like fertilizers and some of the manufacturing or oil sort of derived products that might need it as a feedstock, but that's a pretty small scheme of things. And yeah, I guess the idea that we need more gas for it as a transitional fuel, I think is a bit contested. But I think also that's not exactly what the chief scientist said. He didn't. I don't think. I have to read his comments more carefully, but I don't actually think he was calling for an expansion of the gas industry, rather than suggesting that.
I watched a TV program days ago. I think in that TV program, he did mention that gas will play a very significant role in the transition to balance renewables.
Well, in that case, I can say I disagree with him, because gas, gas just doesn't, like, in the scheme of the gas, the system at the moment, gas for electricity is a small part of it, and looking to be, probably going to become smaller over time. At least I hope so, from a climate perspective. And yeah, there are alternative options. But yeah, no, there's these concerns about the Dunkelflaut in the electricity sector. So the Dunkelflaut is a dark lull, and this is a multi-period day in without wind and without sunlight, and that we need gas to do that. And that may be the case, but that's a contested idea. There could be alternatives. Actually, hydrogen is a contender there. But what I would say to that, in the scheme of things, if we are powering, if we are using gas for that particular use case in the electricity sector, that is a tiny fraction of the gas we actually produce at the moment, and it's a small fraction of the gas that we use in the electricity sector now. So I think at a minimum that idea that we need it is I guess incorrect. But yeah, it's obviously a very political charged environment with all the talk of the gas-fired recovery.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Next question, Raimundo, if you could grab the microphone, introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hi, I'm Raimundo. I work at Environment Victoria as a campaigner, and I was wondering, how could an LNG import terminal in Victoria or New South Wales affect the level of market concentration? And I'm thinking particularly in the case of AGL, which is planning to operate directly the LNG import terminal and not contract with third parties.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the question there is, so a lot of the competition stuff I was talking about was in the electricity sector, and not so much the gas sector. So that would probably have bigger competition implications for the gas industry, I would suspect, which is notoriously opaque and has pretty poor market concentration issues itself. I think even worse than the electricity sector. I don't imagine that that will do a great deal to improve competition issues specifically, but yeah, I'm sort of a little bit out of my wheelhouse, so I'm not entirely sure.
Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. Next question, Stephen Chalice, if you could grab the mic and introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, Simon and Dylan. It's Stephen Charles here from Impact Investment Group, and we're a utility scale solar farm owner. Dylan, just wondering, seeing some pretty big renewable plants come online now, 500 megawatt wind farms and the like. How do you see that resolving this market concentration issue, and over sort of what time frame?
Well, it all comes back to ownership. You know, who owns them is the big question there. So yeah, I mean, if the wind farms are owned by, you know, if the wind farms in New South Wales and owned by AGL, it's probably going to do very little for improving competition. If it's, you know, owned by a third party or another company that could improve competition quite a lot. There's a sort of a subtlety to it though around things like pivotal supply indexes and HHI and so on, is the degree to which you incorporate renewable energy into those measures. Because I think in the way the AER at least does, you know, treats wind capacity, they basically derate it according to how much it contributes to periods. I can't remember the specifics, but you know, a 500 megawatt wind farm might only contribute to say 50 megawatts in periods of scarcity or some number, and then so the way that it affects metrics, and I guess to some extent the way that it actually impacts competition is very much dependent on how much it interacts with those scarcity periods and periods where, you know, basically when there's lots of renewable energy, competition isn't generally when an issue. It's more in or certainly that's been the case in South Australia. It's a bit more complex when you're thinking about shadow pricing, but yeah, how it contributes to those peak periods is fundamental to how you think about it, how it impacts competition.
Great, thanks for that, Stephen. Tim Forsey, you've got a bit of a cheeky question, given that you've got half of the OpenNem team on screen at the moment. Do you want to ask a question or any other comments?
Yeah, sure. So folks may be familiar with the OpenNem tool that you guys have built, which is amazing and gives us a heck of a lot of visibility into what's going on in the electricity market right now or 10 years ago. So a similar thing could be done using AEMO data for the gas, which they publish you know, on a very timely basis. So how about someone building a tool where we can get some good visibility of these gas flows? We could see which direction these pipelines are flowing, how much the gas is leaving states, etc.
Yep, I think it's a great idea, Tim. And you know, that's on the you know, the to-do list, but it's just, yeah, it's a little bit down the priority order, I guess. It's you know, it's like all things, competing for priorities and dollars. But yeah, it's definitely something that we'd like to expand into at some point. I don't know, maybe yeah. Simon might like to add.
I definitely support that. We need to get a bit of funding for it, but definitely support that. Thanks, Tim. Next question, if I can hand over to Linda Cowan, please.
Thanks, Simon. Hi, Dylan. My question is, well, two, if I'm allowed to ask both of them. First one is, do you believe the proposed expansion of gas industry, for example, the Santos Narrabri project, is really necessary to maintain adequate supply and lower prices? And the second question was, the ACCC has plenty of evidence. Why isn't it acting?
So the first one's easy. I think the answer is quite straightforwardly no. I mean, the amount of gas that Narrabri is supposed to deliver is, I think, 70 petajoules per annum, and you know that's about a fraction. I can't remember exactly, 60-65% of the heating of the residential and consumer and commercial load in just Victoria, you know, that's the sort of order of magnitude we're talking about. I suspect you'd, you know, you could probably electrify that cheaper than building Narrabri, and I suspect faster. You know, with things like you know, heat pumps and so on. So the idea that it is needed is, you know, certainly, you know, I think, you know, there is a need for gas for industrial users that use it as a feedstock, certainly in the short term, until we have, you know, some alternatives such as hydrogen or whatever may be the case. That is, there is a need in that sense. Is there a need to develop the Narrabri gas field? No. And I guess the other part of your question is about cost. Now, the costs of that are a little bit contested. I think they were a bit in the media this week. Earlier, they were reported as, you know, $7.40 a gigajoule, or I think now $6.40 a gigajoule or thereabouts. You know, that's still not cheap gas. You know, worth pointing out that that $6.40 is the you know, at the flange price. I think it's the way they phrase it. That's the price where it is. You still need to put it in a pipeline and get it to where you need to get it. So in any case, you're talking $8 a gigajoule for gas from Narrabri, and yeah, it sort of, you know, defies logic to think that a site that requires $8 a gigajoule to recover its cost can lower prices, where, you know, prices are, I mean, well, even before COVID, prices were coming down. I think that's a point that people often miss, is that, you know, the gas prices actually started coming down before COVID, and were probably below $8 before the impacts of COVID really hit. So just from a pure, a logical sense, it doesn't make any sense that adding a higher cost supply could lower prices. But and the second question around why doesn't the AECCC do anything? That's a good question. I think they have tried. I mean, they've, you know, I pointed to that that example with AGL, where they tried to prevent the acquisition of AGL, and were overturned by something called the Australian Competition Tribunal. I think that Competition Tribunal actually no longer exists. It's something that Josh Frydenberg got rid of, for better or worse. So, you know, there may be, you know, if they do take actions, they may not be overturned by, you know, a sort of higher court these days. I guess in the in the report, they did sort of recommend doing, you know, at least, you know, they didn't quite recommend divestiture of powers, you know, or the sort of big stick legislation that's being talked about, but they do, I guess, now have that at their disposal, and they, you know, certainly aware of these issues. Perhaps if there was, you know, perhaps now that they may be more willing to sort of investigate some of these issues and prosecute, you know, the case for some of these market power issues. But yeah, remains to be seen, I guess.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that one. Second last question, quick question and answer. Tony Bannister, please.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Just what if you wanted to add to Tim Forsey's replies online, how well do we quantify the fugitive emissions from the production and supply of gas in Australia?
Sorry, how do we?
How well do we quantify that?
Look, I don't know the answer to that. One of my former colleagues would have a much better answer to that. A bloke called Dimitri Lafleur, also a doctor who now works for CSIRO. He'd have a much better answer to that. I think I can confidently say not very well, but that's about the extent of what I know.
Great, thanks, Tony. Thanks, Dylan. And then for last question, if I could hand over to Mike Sanderford, please.
Ah, excellent.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Dylan. I think the importance of this work, and I think anyone who wants to read more about it can contact Dylan for the paper that we have put together on it, is just how we need to manage the intersections between different markets as we move forward. Transitions inevitably introduce issues of complex interactions, market power changes, and the ability to express that is going to change through it. So we simply need to address that. A lot of these issues were sort of foreseen well before the opening of the LNG exports, that these things would transpire, not explicitly through shadow pricing and such things, but the tightness in the markets was definitely seen to be an issue. But such was the nature of the power expressed by the participants on all sides. Those things were not addressed early on, and we ended up in a pretty dire situation. I've heard figures of 100,000 jobs in gas-related industries going from the eastern seaboard, and dependent, and industry that's dependent on that. Now that's a big ask. There is a projected shortage in gas supply to industry coming on, and it does need to be addressed. And so we need to address how we do use gas. You know, is it sensible to be burning gas for heating in this day and age? Those sorts of things. How does it intersect with the electricity market? These are ongoing issues. We've learned a lot. There's a lot more to learn. Thank you, Dylan, for showing us all about it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike. Dylan, did you want any closing remarks on that?
I don't think so. I think Mike's done a better job than I ever could.
Well, thank you very much, Dylan. That was really illuminating. I think very few people understand the dynamics of the gas market and how it interacts with the electricity market. So we've all learned a lot. So thank you very much for your preparation and presentation on that. I'd like to invite all attendees to find details of upcoming webinars on the Climate and Energy College and Energy Transition Hub's websites. This is one of a series of fascinating webinars, and would love to have you come along for more. I'd like to close by thanking Dr. Dylan Mcconnell, all of those who asked questions, and everyone who attended. Thank you very much, and a reminder that this webinar will be posted on our websites very soon. Thank you very much. See you next time.
Right, thanks.